relationship. Professor Goldgeier is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He's also director of their Institute for European Studies, European, Russia, and Eurasian Studies. And he's had a very interesting career, specializing in our relations with Russia, essentially. He earlier had taught both at Berkeley, where he got his PhD, having gone to Harvard before that, and the Gilman School before that, to which there usually is riotous applause. Yeah. He also, early in his career, was a Council on Foreign Relations fellow, both at State Department and the National Security Council. Today, he's an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, in addition to his academic assignments. His three books are really very, very interesting. He's written on, first of all, leadership style, Soviet foreign policy, putting him in an area of study prior to the end of the Cold War. He's written a question of a book concerning whether, not whether, but when, the U.S. decision to expand NATO. I should note that for the first book, he received the Furnace Award, which is a very great honor. His last book pertains obviously and directly to the topic tonight. It's U.S.-Russian relationships since the end of the Cold War, which is an extraordinarily interesting chapter in our foreign policy history. When we talked about what he would talk about tonight, I wanted to make sure that we didn't lose sight of Russia, which gets lost in the swirl of events, and she is hugely important. He had suggested a possible title of America, Europe, and Russia, Can We Heal the Rifts, which is fairly timely given Condoleezza Rice's tour of Europe. He, of course, will address the assigned topic tonight, but is certainly open during the Q&A to questions on the second topic, which is right in front of us. It's my great pleasure to present Professor Goldgeier.
Well, thanks to Frank Bird for inviting me here. It's always, of course, very nice to be in Baltimore, and it's so nice to see a few relatives, an old teacher, and to see all of you here. I greatly appreciate it. And his comment, I will try to keep his comment in mind about the questions. Also, from the standpoint of the speaker, there's nothing worse than having a speaker who goes on too long or who takes your question and goes on too long. So we'll try to have as much of a discussion as we can, especially because this is such an interesting time in U.S. foreign policy, given the kinds of the agenda that the President has proposed and the Secretary's trip. Now, I didn't have that much foresight because I didn't know that the talk would be during the Secretary's trip, but I think those broader sets of issues are quite important. And the reason, one of the reasons, in addition to not losing sight of the topic I'm going to address in a moment, for not having the talk on the broader one, is that the Council here was supposed to have the Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia last month, and she wasn't able to attend, and so this was going to follow on that. But since she didn't say anything, we can talk, especially in advance. If you get her successor in here after me, you can, if I say something that he disagrees with, you can just say, hey, Goldgeier says that you're wrong. So you can do that. I should also say that my interest over the last 7, 8, 9 years has been on trying to understand the formulation of U.S. foreign policy with respect to both Europe and Russia, and how the United States has sought to manage these very important relationships in a world that's changed quite a bit from what we had during the Cold War. And of course, those relationships have changed quite dramatically in the aftermath of both September 11th and then the war in Iraq. So set the context there, and then now sort of move through a set of issues with respect to the U.S.-Russia relationship and why we should even be talking about a rethinking which requires us to go back a little bit and think about where we were at the end of the Cold War, how we've come along. I promise it won't take too long. How we've come along since then, and where we are today, especially given Secretary Rice's recent meeting with the Russian foreign minister, and President Bush in 2 weeks will be meeting with President Putin in Bratislava. Now, go back to that period, 89 to 91, the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, and then, of course, most dramatically, the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. Quite an extraordinary time. And I can tell you, as a professor, there's nothing more challenging than trying to convey that drama to students who have absolutely no recollection of the period whatsoever. Within 2 years, the incoming freshman class will have been born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. At that time, the stated goal of American foreign policy with respect to the part of the world we're going to talk about specifically in this part. I'm always happy to talk about anything. We can talk about any part of the world after in the Q&A. The stated goal was to work with our European allies to create a Europe whole and free. And this policy had several major pillars during the course of the 1990s. Pillar one, reach out to the Central and Eastern Europeans. And over time, not initially, but over time, that became trying to include those countries in both NATO and the European Union. Second pillar was to end the bloodshed in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia. This was a huge issue for Southeastern Europe and the stability of that part of Europe, and that had to be the second pillar of trying to create a Europe whole and free. Third was to try to help Russia become a market democracy, and to have a market economy, and to try to draw Russia closer to the West, taking advantage of the opportunity presented by the end of the Cold War and the hope that Russia would no longer be America's major adversary, but would become possibly a major partner of the United States. And in the early 90s, there was even talk, there wasn't so much talk about Russia as a potential member of the European Union, but there was talk about Russia as a potential member of NATO. So there really was this thought that Russia could be drawn closer to the West. Now, if we think about those sets of issues, where we are today as the President prepares to head off to Europe, following up this very important visit that Secretary Rice has had in Europe, think about those pillars. NATO and the European Union have enlarged to include Central and Eastern Europe, this huge step last year where so many countries came in to both institutions, and where now most of Europe is included in these bedrock institutions of the West. So that went pretty well. Former Yugoslavia, painful, of course, in the 90s, but we had the Dayton Accords in Bosnia in 1995, and then the war in Kosovo in 1999, and since that time, country Slovenia had been on the path earlier, but since that time, since the 90s, Croatia and Macedonia, in particular, are on the path to try to join the West, and even Serbia, although slowly, has been trying to overcome its past in new relations with Europe. So that's gone fairly well also. And then there's Russia, which has had a very interesting evolution since the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. Now, Secretary Rice, in her meetings, after her meetings with the foreign minister, said publicly some of the things that the United States has been concerned about in terms of the internal trends within Russia and this question of the evolution of Russia and Russia's relations with the West, particularly from an internal standpoint. Problems with an independent media, less and less independent over time. The whole set of issues surrounding the jailing of Yukos Oil CEO Mikhail Khodorkovsky that led not only to his being thrown in jail, but then also the assault on his company, which, however it had come to be in the 90s, had become a very important standard bearer for more Western practices in the Russian companies. And she also mentioned the whole issue with respect to some of the other political trends that are going on, for example, the elimination of elections for governor, who will now be appointed. And there was also the whole set of issues that we saw recently with respect to Russia's behavior during the Ukrainian elections, Putin's efforts to try to stand on the side of the presidential candidate who was involved in an effort to falsify the election results and who was ultimately unsuccessful. And this was really quite disturbing, because here you had election results that were falsified. You had a population that was trying to take that election back, and we had that Orange Revolution, and the Russians weren't on the side of taking the election back for the population of Ukraine. And in fact, when you think about Ukraine and you think about Russia, you see countries that are going, that look to be going in very different directions. Ukraine, still lots of problems, but a president who's really now oriented toward the West and talks about, while maintaining good relations with Russia, also wanting to join institutions like the European Union and NATO. Russia is not going in that direction. And one of the things we've seen when we look at Russia's relations with the West, attitude toward the West, it is not what it was in the late 80s and early 90s, when Russia seemed to be looking to try to really be integrated in those institutions. Certainly in the Yeltsin period, there really was this sense that maybe Russia might be on a path to be part of those institutions, and that we don't see. We see a policy that's designed to have good relations, stable relations with the West, but not of the West. And so I often think about it that we're not seeing an anti-Western policy. We're not seeing a pro-Western policy. We're seeing a non-Western policy coming out of the Kremlin. Now, when we look specifically today at the U.S.-Russian relationship, one thing comes immediately to one's attention, which is there's almost no substance to the relationship. There's almost nothing. Now, if you did have an official here from the State Department, she or he would tell you about all the things that are going on in the U.S.-Russian relationship, but there's really nothing of substance. Compared to, when you compare back to the 1990s, for example, when you still had a lot of issues like arms control, the relationship with NATO, economic assistance, all these big issues that were being discussed and worked on between the United States and Russia. Now, some of the reason why there's no substance to the relationship has to do with that some of those issues became irrelevant. The economic assistance issues, for example, the United States doesn't need to be providing economic assistance of the kind, certainly in a state-to-state sense, even if I'm going to talk about civil society in a minute, but in the state-to-state sense, Russia, the high price of oil has done wonders for Russia's coffers, and so Russia can afford to do what it needs to do itself. We're not in that situation we were. So there's a reason for some of these things not being there, but on others it's simply really a lack of interest on both sides in pursuing anything substantive. So if we look at arms control, for example, there was a treaty signed in 2002 that ostensibly was designed to reduce the levels of nuclear weapons. I'll come back to that in a minute, but it really was not, did not do much, and there's no interest on either side in pursuing anything beyond that. And if you look at the NATO-Russia relationship, where there was a lot of effort in the 90s to try to really figure out ways that NATO and Russia could work together, and Russia was brought in, for example, to the implementation force in Bosnia, and there was a council set up and all that. Both sides really lost interest in pursuing that as well. Now, the approach under this president, sort of thinking about the last couple years, sort of what lies behind the lack of substance in the relationship. And really, the approach the administration has taken to Russia has been that Russia is no longer the major force in world affairs that it once was. So there's not a lot Russia can do. What it can do is undermine certain initiatives that the United States might be taking in various parts of the world. So the goal really from the foreign policy apparatus in the United States has been, let's just, try to have a nice relationship with Russia, talk nice about and to Russia, don't have too much substance, just make sure Russia doesn't undermine the more general goals that the United States has in foreign policy. And the belief was that if the United States, and the President has certainly done this since June of 2001, said enough nice things about Putin and about the relationship, that we'd at least on a superficial level have cooperative relations, and at least the Russians wouldn't be actively trying to block things that the United States was trying to do. Now, why not just continue with that strategy? Why do we need a rethinking? Several reasons why we need a rethinking. First of all, early on in this approach, it did seem as if the President Bush, was getting things from the Russians of importance to him. Now, certainly the most important was the Russian attitude after September 11, 2001. And much has been made of the Putin effort to reach out to President Bush, certainly largely because of his own self-interest in trying to get his conflict in Chechnya seen as part of the broader war on terror, which he was able to do, at least from the standpoint of the way the American government has approached things. But he did reach out, and as far as we know, certainly what was said, the intelligence sharing that went on, especially in the war in Afghanistan, that occurred after September 11th, because the Russians had a lot of intelligence on Afghanistan, had a big interest in Afghanistan that they'd had, of course, since the days that they were occupying the country. This intelligence sharing was deemed quite important, and so this was something that the United States could get as it focused on what was really important after September 11th, which was, of course, the war on terror. Now, but that wasn't all. That wasn't all that President Bush was getting. In addition, you may recall that one of the things that he wanted to do was to withdraw from the Antiballistic Missile Treaty that the United States had with the Soviet Union and then Russia in order to pursue his dreams of missile defense and all the stuff we're building out in Alaska to protect us. And there was a concern about the Russians causing problems. In fact, it was one of the early issues for the Bush administration, causing problems with Europe. The Europeans were quite concerned about this issue, and President Bush was able to manage this issue. Putin did not, in fact, cause much of a problem for him in the effort to withdraw from that treaty. The United States sought to set up bases in Central Asia as part of its efforts to fight the war on terror, and the Kremlin also did not seek to get in the way of the United States' efforts in that regard as well. So you're seeing things that the President's getting, and so quite understandable that he would have the approach that he did toward the Russian government. Over time, there's been less and less, at least for all outward appearances, that President Bush has been getting from his cozy relationship with President Putin. Russia continues to support the Iranian nuclear program. Russia continues to work toward to helping Iran build its nuclear reactor in Bushehr, the reactor in Bushehr in Iran. This reactor is scheduled to go online in 2006. There's been no break in the Russian efforts in supporting the Iranian nuclear program. And as you well recall, in the war, when the President led the coalition of the willing in 2003 against Iraq, Russia was there with Germany and France in opposing the American-led effort in Iraq. Then, most recently, as I mentioned earlier, you had the whole set of issues with respect to Ukraine and the Russian government's unhelpful efforts in helping Ukraine move toward a freer path. There are also some other areas. The other problem with the strategy of we'll talk nice, get something in return, keep these issues off the table, focus on other things that are much more important to the United States, is that because of the increasing authoritarian trends within Russia, it is more difficult in the context of the president's emphasis on the freedom agenda. When you use the word freedom in your inaugural address 27 times and you use the word liberty 15 times, it's hard, it makes it a little tougher to ignore those countries that seem to be going in a direction other than that of freedom and liberty. When then Secretary-designate Rice was giving her testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, she was talking about outposts of tyranny, and she labeled 6 countries that were outposts of tyranny. And Russia is not we're not talking about a tyranny, but the more you talk about this freedom agenda, the harder it is to ignore what's going on in Russia and not to talk about the kinds of things that are going on inside of Russia. So what to do? What to do? What's necessary is to try to put into practice what Rice was talking about when she met with the Russian foreign minister the other day. And that is to try to put American principles front and center and talk about the importance of these principles, not because they're American, but because the president believes these principles, and America's always believed these principles are universal principles. And so to put these principles front and center to help promote civil society within Russia, but also continue to cooperate, to try to work and cooperate with the Russian government on areas of importance to the United States. And of course, whenever you're trying to push an agenda such as the one the president is pushing, this freedom agenda, you have this very difficult balance, because if you want to stir things up in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and other places and try to push them in a more freer direction, you're still trying to do business with these governments on areas that are important to the United States. And so you have to have some way of trying to make this balance. So how to do that? What's required is a dual-track strategy of finding areas on which the United States can re-engage with Russia and accomplish things. There are important things to accomplish, especially in the nuclear sphere, while also at the same time trying to keep the focus also on these principles that have been enunciated both by President Bush and by Secretary Rice. Now, part of that means that at the same time you're talking about the principles, you've got to put something, you really got to have to put something forward that's concrete, and that you would be offering the Russian government something, and of course you would be doing so because it's in the United States' interest as well. And I would say that the most important place to start would be where it should have been all along, and that's the effort to really push forward on dismantling nuclear weapons and the safe and secure dismantlement of nuclear weapons. I think we can look back on the period since the end of the Cold War and say that the greatest missed opportunity that we've had since the end of 1991 was not doing more to reduce the level of nuclear weapons in Russia and to ensure the safety and security of that dismantlement. Now, I mentioned before the 2002 Treaty of Moscow, the Strategic Arms Treaty that Bush and Putin signed, that calls for reductions in nuclear weapons to much lower levels. The end date for the treaty is 2012, which is fine. The problem with that treaty is that it's not real reductions. Basically, what's in that treaty is to, and I promise I won't get too arcane. The problem is, what's in that treaty is to take the warheads off the missiles and put them in storage so that these weapons won't be operational. But we're not actually getting rid of the weapons themselves. And the reason is not because of the Russians. The reason is because the Pentagon doesn't want to go down to very low numbers. why should this be? How could this be? Is it really impossible for the United States strategic interests to go down to 1,000 nuclear weapons? And having 1,000 that one can call operational. The United States today is deterred by 4, 5, 6 North Korean nuclear weapons. The United States today argues it can't move forward on a strategy of coercion with respect to North Korea because of already the existence of nuclear weapons in North Korea. If that's the case, it seems very difficult for the Pentagon at the same time to make the argument that it must have the possibility for much greater numbers of nuclear weapons in terms of, it's lower than the Cold War, but that it has some need for great numbers of nuclear weapons in order to deter potential adversaries. The other thing going along with this is greater transparency on both sides. If we want it from Russia, we're going to have to allow it in the United States as weapons are dismantled, on the transparency on that and the security of those. Just mentioned to you the Nunn-Lugar program, named for Senator Sam Nunn, former Senator Nunn, and Senator Lugar, who put forward this program in the early 1990s precisely for the purpose of trying to get at the loose nukes in Russia and even more broadly the weapons of mass destruction. And the Nunn-Lugar program has been funded at about $500 million a year. The defense budget is $400 billion, not including Iran and Afghanistan. And this program for loose nukes, the president keeps saying, most pressing issue is keeping nuclear weapons out of the hands of terrorists. You put those two together, we really do have a security threat, and this program is $500 million. And then the last one I'll mention on the side of offering things to the Russians is trying to offer something on the trade area. Looks like actually things are on track for Russia to become a member of the World Trade Organization. There have been meetings with U.S. Trade Representative Zellick, to be Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zellick, on Russia's membership in the World Trade Organization. They're talking about potentially being able to wrap that up within the year. It's a very important set of issues. Russia is still subject to the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was the amendment to the 1974 Trade Act that was put in place in order to try to get at immigration restrictions, and to try to deny Russia most favored nation, that what was then called most favored nation trade status. This is really grates on the Russians. It's really grates on the Russians to have this still there. And one of the things the United States could do would be to graduate Russia from the Jackson-Vanik Amendment even before it becomes a member of the World Trade Organization. So, but you're going to offer them something, then there are other things that the United States might wish to do in order to try to promote some other things that it sees as being in its interests. One, on Iran. Russia's going to complete the nuclear reactor in Iran. Russia has a deal with Iran by which the spent fuel from the reactor goes to Russia, so that it can't be used for an Iranian nuclear weapons program. Reactor's completed. Iran has to stick to the deal. Not clear what happens after the reactor's completed, and I think one of the things the United States could push for would be international oversight of this process by which the spent fuel goes to Russia. Second thing the United States should be pushing for is an internationalization of conflicts that most of you have probably never heard of, that are taking place within the former Soviet Union, in particular in the countries of Moldova and Georgia. And you may say to yourself, gee, how important could that be? The problem is there are conflicts within those countries in which the Russian government is playing a very important role in keeping those conflicts from being resolved, and the Russian military is heavily involved in making it very difficult for the governments of those two countries. And what you thus have on that territory are what, if they were states, we would call them failed states. These are these uncontrollable territories within both Georgia and Moldova that the governments of those countries do not control, and you get all sorts of possibilities for trafficking, for the possibility of transit of weapons of mass destruction, and also potential terrorism. So this is really quite an issue that the United States should be focusing on. And then the other thing that the United States should be doing is really trying to continue as much as possible to fund so-called civil society in Russia, the non-governmental organizations, the private institutions, those institutions that the United States funded very seriously in Ukraine, and we saw the results. You know, the Russians charged the United States with meddling and being responsible for the Orange Revolution and so on, which in the immediate term was not correct, but in the longer term was. The longer term was, because the United States had been helping to provide funding for these groups, space for these groups to operate, so that they could try to develop a freer society. There is something called the Freedom Support Act that's been in place ever since the end of the Cold War, and the Freedom Support Act provides funds to this region. The funds for Russia have gone down quite dramatically, and in fact, every year that the Bush administration has been in office, they have proposed quite low numbers for the Freedom Support Act. The Congress has added back to that in the final budget, but it would be a good time for the Bush administration to actually push for serious money for the Freedom Support Act. And then finally, an issue that's close to my heart, being at a university, is trying to expand the educational opportunities for Russians to come study in the United States. And I would argue that's true for any of these countries with which the United States has an interest in promoting this freedom agenda. And you may think, well, how difficult can that be? In fact, today it is extremely difficult because of the problem of homeland security and the problem of these, it's not just foreign students, it's anybody, getting visas to come to the United States. And all of the universities are suffering a tremendous amount in terms of having lost foreign students. And what you have in that, I have to take 2 minutes on this because it's such an important issue to me. What you have is young people wanted. The United States has the best educational system in the world, so young people are naturally drawn to study in the United States. But you know, if you can't really come to the United States, you look around for other opportunities. If you're a young person in China or India, you don't really have to come to the United States anymore to study engineering. You can, in fact, study in China and India. But also, you can go to Europe, you can go to Australia. And we're seeing increasing numbers of foreign students going to these other places to study and not to the United States. Does it matter? It matters for all sorts of reasons, but I'll just cite one in the context of what we are talking about. The new Georgian president, Saakashvili, who came to power after Georgia had their Rose Revolution a year before Ukraine had its Orange Revolution. And Saakashvili, who's a young guy, late 30s, very young guy, and we were very fortunate that when he came to Washington for his first visit with President Bush, he came to the George Washington University to have a meeting with us and to give a talk, and received our university president's medal and so on. And one of the things he talked about, one of the reasons he came to our university is because he had studied at George Washington University, also at Columbia University, in the mid-1990s. And one of the things he talked about, he had left, he didn't finish, he didn't graduate. He didn't, because he went back to be political, to run for office in Georgia. But one of the things he talked about was how important that experience had been, to understand what it meant to live in a democracy that he could then carry back with him. Well, now he's the president of his country. And so it's very important with Russia, with any of these other countries, that we try not to lose sight of how important it is to have folks come here and study. I promise not to talk too long, so I'll just say a couple things in conclusion, and that'll leave us with about a half an hour or so for Q&A, which will be nice. You know, when we're talking about Russia, Russia is not the major global power that it was during the Cold War. We all understand that, thankfully. We're glad Russia is not the global power that it was during the Cold War. We're glad. We're not as idealistic as we were in the early 1990s. when there was a lot of thought about how much the United States could do to help transform Russia, to help Russia on a path of joining the West, to help bring democratic ideals into Russia. There was certainly a great deal of idealism in the early 90s. We've lost that idealism. We have a government in Russia now that's not interested in being part of institutions in the West that are run by the West. And so that's why I call this a non-Western policy. We still do have a range of issues on which we should be cooperating with the Russians, on which we want to be cooperating with the Russians, on which there should be real substance with the Russian. And I would just close by saying that we should also keep in mind that when the president talks about freedom, which he apparently seems to want to do quite a bit these days, judging by the inaugural and the State of the Union, and I would imagine his remarks when he is also in Europe, he can't just be talking about the Middle East. It's going to be hard enough in the Middle East. And it's hard everywhere. But he can't just say it's important to us in those places and then ignore places like Russia, where it should also be equally important, where there are also people trying to fight to bring democracy to that country, and where the president should show as much interest in that as he does in freedom in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. So with that, I'll close and look forward to any kind of questions you have about this specifically, as we said at the outset, about any feature of U.S., European, Russian relations or the freedom agenda or beyond. Yes, sir. The question had to do with why would a country like the Soviet Union allow itself to collapse, to lose so much of its territory, and wouldn't we have done something to stop something similar, and why didn't they use force to do it? You know, this is one of the great questions of the end of the Cold War. One of the great questions of the end of the Cold War. We still don't really know why the Soviet government didn't do more to try to keep the Soviet Union together. A lot of people will give the argument, well, they couldn't have, they couldn't rely on the military enough, but governments don't usually, as your question implies, they don't usually voluntarily give up all this, give up that kind of territory. And why wasn't there just some attempt by the Gorbachev government, then president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, why wasn't there some attempt to use force to hold it together? He did, in certain periods, he half-heartedly used force in places like Lithuania and Georgia. But I think the best explanation for why the Soviet Union didn't do more is because of the values that Gorbachev himself had, that he wasn't going to use force, he wasn't going to kill people in order to try to keep that country together. And once he had his process, he never intended, became General Secretary in 1985, and he became president several years later. He never intended to have the country fall apart when he started his reforms, but once he started his reforms and allowed openness, you had this effect whereby places that didn't want to be in the country, be part of the Soviet Empire, said, we're leaving. Not all said that. It was a very complicated process. The Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they wanted out. Ukraine had a referendum on December 1st, 1991, which really is what broke the Soviet Union finally, because the Ukrainians voted for an independent Ukraine. Many of the other countries of the Soviet Union didn't want to be, they were forced to be free in a sense. Some of the Central Asian countries, for example, didn't really know what to do with the whole situation, and Russia was less eager to have it be just them and the Central Asians than they had been in a relationship with Ukraine. But you can see, I would make two more points on this particular issue. One, you can see how difficult this still is for the Russians because of what happened in Ukraine. This sense of these countries as being part of a sphere of influence that Russia has, that Russia, if not wanting these territories as part of Russia, wants to have a control over the affairs of these countries. And so this is one of the reasons why Russia wasn't happy with the Rose Revolution in Georgia, really wasn't happy with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And on top of the three Baltic countries joining NATO and the trends for them in terms of their control over the region. And part of it also is tied up with this conception of this problem in Russian history, because Russia as a country was an empire, has been an empire. And so there wasn't a nation state, and then the empire. The Russian history is tied up with the imperial history. Russia had to create a nation state after the end of the Cold War. Had to do what others of us have gone through earlier in history. So then on what basis do you claim that it is? Because there are lots of people who speak Russian who aren't ethnic Russian. There's not even a clear case of what it means to be an ethnic Russian. So they've had a huge set of issues, and it's also been one of the reasons why, because of what happened with the Soviet Union, why President Putin has been so adamant about trying to find, unfortunately, a military solution to his problem of Chechnya, because he doesn't want to preside over the dissolution of Russia the way Gorbachev presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The second comment I wanted to make, and then we'll move on to a different question, is that getting back to the Gorbachev, what was Gorbachev about? And why I would raise that in the context of where we're going. President Bush, at a news conference at the end of January, was asked about what he's going to say to President Putin in Bratislava when they meet on the 24th. And he said, I'm going to remind him that if he wants to look west, he needs to remember our Western values. Now, normally when the president talks about freedom and liberty, remember 27 times freedom and 15 times liberty in the inaugural address, he does so in the context of universal aspirations that are not specifically Western. And I think, in fact, it was unfortunate that he chose that language, and I would hope that he wouldn't do that when he sees President Putin. And there is a reason why I raise this in the context of your question. In 1989, off the coast of Malta, President Bush Sr. met with President Gorbachev to have they had a summit. And then President Bush kept using the term Western values. And Gorbachev said, I believe in these values, but why do you have to keep calling them Western? The question was about the sanctity of contracts in Russia and business investments. I mean, clearly, if there's going to, I should step back. The level of foreign investment in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union has never been as high as the Russians thought it would be. Especially when you compare the level of foreign direct investment in China, of course, you compare even the level of foreign direct investment in Central and Eastern Europe. And so this issue of why not more foreign investment, well, the rule of law helps. A lack of corruption would help. Sanctity of contracts. I think we see this. It's been very interesting to see how the business community has reacted to the whole Yukos oil affair. Because what you don't want to see is investment in a company that then becomes the target of the president of Russia for reasons that seem to be political, because the CEO of Yukos was getting involved in political activities. He was the major funder of civil society activities from within Russia. And this makes it very difficult to attract investment at a time if you're going to be nervous about what's going to be happening to your investments and whether or not the state is going to seek to take control. The state has sought to take more and more control over all sorts of parts of life within that country. And on the other hand, the United States and United States companies have a huge interest in the energy investments within Russia. And so we've seen a level, the United States has a huge interest in investing in energy in Russia. The United States and the West has a huge interest in seeing, the Europeans are already heavily involved in receiving, especially natural gas from Russia. But the United States, given the interest in diversity of supply of oil, has a very big interest in the Russian oil market, in getting that oil to market more quickly, and the whole question of the infrastructure in Russia. And so you need a lot of outside investment, and companies are still willing to play in this game because the stakes are so high, but there's been increasing nervousness over time, especially in the last year or so because of this affair. The question really was about whether the Chinese, what they sought to learn from the Russian experience, and whether or not they've gone about things differently because they saw what happened to Gorbachev, and they saw the way that he simultaneously introduced political and economic reform and then lost control of the country, and the Communist Party of China isn't interested in losing control of the country. I do want to clarify, when I was talking about failed states, what I was referring to was specifically local conflicts within two countries, Moldova and Georgia. There are these regions within those countries that, if they were countries, they would be called failed states. They're not. They're these small regions. I don't know what to call them. They're totally uncontrollable territories. And so, Russia's not a failed state. Russia's, quite. I think it's probably weaker than we realize, but certainly quite a functioning government. On the Chinese lessons, well, I can tell you that they are quite interested still in these issues. They certainly were at the time, and you have several issues, several responses that I think are helpful in thinking about how the Chinese have viewed this, and also how the Russians have viewed this. First of all, a lot of criticism from within Russia that the Soviet government should have followed the path of the Chinese government, that the Communist Party should have allowed for more freedom in the economic area and allowed Russia to develop economically, but tried to maintain control politically, and the mistake was in following the path they chose rather than following the Chinese path. Certainly there was a lot of interest in the 90s, early 90s, for obvious reasons, as the Chinese looked and saw the Soviet Union fall apart. There was a lot of obvious interest in what had happened and what lessons could be drawn. What's remarkable to me is that they still have that interest in studying what happened and in thinking about what happened. I was invited to a conference last year in China, and the conference was on the collapse of the Soviet Union, what happened and lessons learned, which was quite a challenge for those of us from the West who were writing papers, because no one really wanted to write a how-to paper. Well, here's what happened, here's how you can avoid this. So you got to be a little careful in how you write your paper for that kind of conference. But it was sponsored by the Communist Party of China, and to have an interest in. So when we were in the room, we just spoke into the hidden microphones in the ceiling, so they would make sure they wrote everything down. I made the comment there, why would you be interested in this issue now? Why would you be interested in this issue now? China is in such a different place from what the position that the Soviet Union was in. This is not, I don't think, I mean, I would love to see greater freedom in China, and I think eventually we'll get it in part because of the economic growth that has developed. But managing the kind of economic growth that they have, and managing that within whatever kind of transition may occur down the road, there are lots of other countries that they might be thinking about in terms of the management of the economic growth. And it seems to me that Soviet period is really a long ago period that doesn't really apply to looking at the factories that you see bursting out around Shanghai and elsewhere. So, but just as you suggested, they still, at least from my experience from this conference, at least parts of the government still seem quite interested in these issues. The question was about, I had mentioned missed opportunities. What kinds of missed opportunities were there in the 1990s? And then also, how do we explain, we have this very large country, Russia, has a lot of natural resources, has an educated workforce, and has this GDP the size of a small European country. And in fact, it's even less than that. And when you look at the kind of statements Putin has made ever since coming to office, it's been about how, with high growth rates, Russia could hope to be, if it had high enough growth rates, it could hope to be in 10 or 15 years where Portugal is. And Portugal's not going to be there in 10 or 15 years, so they'll have to find a different comparison. But it's really quite a striking. He understands how serious this is. On the missed opportunities, I mentioned the whole question of loose nukes. I think much more could have been done, should have been done. I think there should have been more funding put into it, more effort to try to reduce this problem. And you recall this came up during the campaign this past year in the United States when Senator Kerry suggested that he would have a plan for trying to do this on a more accelerated schedule than the Bush administration has gone forward on. So that's one area. It's hard, though, in the larger context on missed opportunities, because one of the things that you find when you look back at this, and I think is very important as we think about other countries that are the object of our freedom agenda, is that, and there are all sorts of reasons why Russia is different from a lot of other places, but we can't, when we talk about this agenda and trying to bring democracy in markets and so on, we can't just talk about Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan are very unusual cases. The defeat in the war, the previous government's loss of legitimacy, the tremendous American occupation of a very significant extent, the context in which those countries existed, some of the prior histories of those countries, and the efforts that the United States was willing to make, for example, in Europe, of course, with the Marshall Plan. Russia in the 90s, and I'm not suggesting the United States should have had a Marshall Plan for Russia in the 1990s, but what you do find when you look at Russia and look at the, sort of put together the balance sheet of how the United States did with trying to help Russia with its developments, either in politics or the economy, you realize how much the United States in the early 90s overestimated its ability to bring change to a country like that. And yes, it's much larger than the other countries that are the object of the freedom agenda. But it would be good, in thinking about these other countries that the United States has in mind, it would be good to remember the humbling experience of the 90s and not always say, well, we did it in Germany and Japan, we could do it in these other places. Because it's not that simple, and Russia provides a very different kind of example. One other missed opportunity I would mention, I've always felt that there could have been more done between Russia and NATO to develop mechanisms for conflict resolution, mechanisms for working together. NATO works as an alliance with countries that develop the ability to operate together in theaters of conflict. And there was an effort to have a council between the United States and Russia, and to have NATO and Russia, to have a forum where things could be discussed between NATO and Russia. And I mentioned the effort to have Russia be part of the peacekeeping forces in Bosnia and then in Kosovo, which were important. But I always felt that rather than talk about these fora for having conversations, find some practical exercises that the United States and that NATO and Russia could find together to do exercises together for potentially, for example, dealing with preventing shipments, unwanted shipments of weapons to mass destruction. Do those kinds of things to build up some more efforts at cooperation, practical efforts on the ground that might lead to something later. Blueprint. I am not an economist, and I don't play one on TV, and I'm not gonna try to pretend to be an economist. But it would seem that for Russia to develop, the notion that Russia can do so by reasserting more state control over the economy is not going to be helpful. And the pattern of this government has been to assert greater control over all aspects of life. Renationalization is not the answer. And if you look at Russia's own investments, the investments of Russians, huge capital flight in the 90s, Russian money staying in Russia for a period, and now we've seen in the past year or so. Again, a lot of capital flight. So I think that the markets will have sent signals to Russia. Russia, one of President Putin's top economic advisors was asked at the end of 2003, what's been the greatest what's been of greatest benefit and what's been of greatest cost to the Russian economy? I think it was how it was phrased. I forget the exact phrasing. But his advisor said the greatest benefit has been the price of oil, and the greatest cost has been the price of oil. The greatest benefit, the price of oil, because the price of oil has not. Yeltsin has said, occasionally, Yeltsin's still out there speaking every once in a while. Yeltsin has said, if the price of oil had been this high when he was president, things wouldn't have been quite as bad in Russia then either. You can do a lot when the price of oil is high in terms of having a lot of money at your disposal, and our experience has been that price will not stay high forever. But why the cost? And his advisor said it has had this huge cost because it has enabled Russia to avoid doing the kind of restructuring of the economy that it would have if there had been more pressure. It's taken the pressure off. And it's too bad that it hasn't used this period, because when the price of oil drops, as it will even further, then you're going to have, and I know that there are arguments the other way, especially with the increasing consumption from China and so on, but I do believe that the lessons we should learn is that these prices are cyclical, and the Russian government will be in quite a difficult situation. Well, the question was about the Russian mafia and whether that's a large part of the problem. I think it needs to be seen in part of the larger question of corruption in Russia and the question of what's required to do business in Russia in terms of bribery, both with private actors as well as with public actors, government actors. And I think it's one of the interesting features of Russia today, because when President Putin talks about what he's trying to do, his response, by the way, in the early issues about democracy has always been that he doesn't want the failed democracy of the Yeltsin period. He doesn't want the chaos of the Yeltsin period. He makes the argument that Russia needs a more managed democracy, perhaps getting back to the China question, that Russia needs an experience with something more controlled as it tries to develop economically before it can really have democracy as we would understand it. And although he uses a lot of rhetoric reminiscent of the Stalin period, we'll leave that aside for the moment and focus on one of the other heroes that he likes to mention, and that's the General Pinochet from Chile, and Pinochet's control over that country while it developed economically, and then the ability to have democracy in Chile later. But many have noted that one of the things Pinochet did was to limit the amount of corruption within the Chilean system, and it's one of the things that President Putin has not done within the Russian system, and partly related to these questions